Okay, I am Frank Musica of the Schinner Risk Management Program. I'm an architect and attorney with over 45 years of experience in design and construction. In the last decade, there's been much discussion of new ways to finance capital assets. Borrowing from Australia and other countries, the idea of turning over what in the U.S. has been a public duty to create infrastructure to a private investment group has gained some traction. This is caused in part because of the reluctance of our lawmakers, and to an extent the taxpayers, to face up to the infrastructure and other public works needs of the nation at the local, state, and federal levels. So signing over the ministerial duties of a government to the private sector is seen as a way to accomplish goals that are elusive when the careers of politicians are put at risk. So today we are going to discuss public-private partnerships, and I'll point out to you the increased level of contractual risk a design firm assumes when it's signing a contract, usually with a design builder, to provide design services on the P3 project. Basically, a P3 is simple in concept, but they're extremely complex in execution. The idea that a public governmental entity contracts with a private entity to take over all responsibilities for the creation and conduct of a public facility becomes really complicated once the issues of creation, control, and cash flow are carefully examined. Under normal public procurement, a project is authorized and funding is appropriated, and often without any real focus on the life cycle costs of the project, or whether the expenditure of public funds is the most efficient use of scarce financial resources for the non-military public entities that put a capital asset in place. With a P3, that changes. Under P3, once it's assigned to a private sector limited purpose entity, an outside financial market really makes decisions that public entities are rarely empowered to make. They finance, they decide on the design, often take responsibility to build and operate and maintain the capital asset that is supposed to provide a benefit to the public. There we go. A P3 really shifts the government function to the private sector. But it's not privatization, where the asset ownership is actually changed. For the most part, the creation of capital assets for use by government entities or for the benefit of the public is what's called a ministerial obligation of the government. It has to be accomplished for the benefit of the public. In some cases, in unusual cases, the decision is discretionary. There might be an opportunity for a government entity to create something not required by law, but that could provide a benefit. With a P3, the only decision is not whether the need is real or the project is speculative. The only consideration is whether a project will make money for its investors. So a P3 single-purpose entity is given a concession to create and operate over a long period what taxpayers would consider a public facility. Again, it's not privatization. The ownership of the asset is not private, but its creation and operation is. It does blur the ownership and control issues, and often, especially in early forms of P3s, that created major problems and major expenses for public entities. Unlike a public project where appropriations or government bonds are used to finance a project, in a P3, the single-purpose entity raises money through debt. Often it's paying at interest at a much higher rate than a government would pay, and equity ownership by investors. Unlike a truly private capital asset, the project is not subject to foreclosure but rather the debt will be repaid and the investors compensated out of cash flows of the project, often user fees such as tolls, or future funding by the public called availability payments. And at times, P3 contracts place the burden of rescuing a poorly planned or poorly executed project on a government entity. So even in a P3, taxpayers could end up bailing out the private investors and perhaps even providing them with a significant return on their investment. This has happened with many of the early P3s, where the government ended up backing the private entities and providing them with a source of revenue, even if the project did not create a source of revenue. So the asset itself is never really at risk, but depending on the P3 arrangements and the complications in that contract between a public entity and a private entity, the public treasury, the taxpayer money, could be at risk. We will discuss two possible revenue streams that will pay back the debt and provide a profit for the investors in more detail. But basically, one is fees, usually paid by tax users of the facility, and the other is a series of payments over time by the government entity. Right? Those are the availability payment system. And the other one is really a risk revenue system where the public-private partnership, the single purpose entity, is taking a risk and is counting on revenue from that project to compensate it for the risk it's taking. Proponents of P3 financing government projects point out to the efficiency and creativity in procurement. And that can be true because there's often fewer constraints on what a public sector concessionaire can do than what a public entity can do. That can be also an advantage if one wants to avoid the regulatory process. For those of you who are following the infrastructure plans of the current administration, the multiple trillions of infrastructure spending that was promised by the Trump administration really promoted this. By turning, for instance, an interstate highway project over to a P3 rather than involving a state DOT, the goal was to avoid the bureaucracy, the regulation, and the protections of the current funding system. The federal government does not have to follow any state rules, and authorizing a P3 to act on the federal government's behalf means that projects can be controlled by some financial entity and not some public works agency at the state level. So rather than paying part of the money to a state and having the state pay part of the money to create a capital improvement, a highway, a bridge, having a P3 do it, they're avoiding the entire state system and really interjecting federal control through this private entity over the state. Now, here's the information on revenue streams in more detail. They're important to design firms because they really can affect how and when, or if that matter, if, design firms get paid for their services. The two methods are the demand payments, that's the risk revenue stream, where the use of the facility is only available to those paying a fee, a toll road, a toll bridge, but it can extend to other public works ranging from convention facilities to public libraries. That pushes the cost to the taxpayers through either tolls or often lease payments. But from the government standpoint, it's very attractive because it's an off-the-balance sheet deal. It doesn't show up as a government expenditure, and it doesn't show up as really some extraordinary expense that the government might have in maintaining the facility. Now, availability payments are a little bit different, and that's basically the public entity and not the end user paying for the cost of the project over time. So rather than appropriate an amount of money this year that will be spent over the next 3 years building a project and then worrying about maintaining it over that time, over the life of the project. Availability payments are really structured in a way so that the government can pay a little bit less now, but over a much longer period of time. The concessionaire finances the project with private funds, and it's really like a mortgage arrangement. The government is saying, okay, that's my property, but to own it, to get it at the end of the concession, I'm going to pay you X amount of money each year for its creation and for its use. Now, that does give the government some control because it's based on availability. So if the project is not ready on time or is not maintained properly, the payments could be withheld. And it still requires, however, public financing and dedicated funding somehow for those availability payments in the future. How it affects a design firm is often firms are forced to remain at risk for the life of the concessionaire's control of the project. And sometimes the payment for services is not seen as a one-time fee, but stretched out as a payment schedule tied to cash flow. So you have to be very careful in how you're getting paid for your services and when you're getting paid for your services. Firms often have found themselves trapped in that kind of compensation plan, and they've greatly suffered because of the cash flow issues. Here are what proponents of P3s tout as the principles, the advantages of financing the operating system. We'll go over these. I want you to pay attention to the fourth principle listed. Part of it is you define what the project is supposed to accomplish. You define that up front. That often can be done by government public works agencies in conjunction with design firms. Sometimes it's done by other outside parties who understand what the project is supposed to do over the life of the project. You're asking the concessionaire to design a work to deliver that service that still remains in the private sector. These are long-term arrangements, often 25 or 30 years, sometimes shorter, but sometimes quite a bit longer. And the control of the asset, the ownership of the asset does not leave the public entity because it's not privatization, but control of the asset does. And that's usually transferred back to the government in some form at the end of the contract. And how it's transferred back in what state of maintenance, for instance, is often written into the public-private partnership. Supposedly, this gives you increased value for money because that's really what the private sector is supposed to be good at. If you look at the costs against conventional procurement or the whole life cost or life cycle cost of the project, that's how you gauge value, and that's how in a private public-private partnership arrangement, the public entity should be determining whether it's getting enough value for the money. Now, the transfer of risk is a little bit different. The transfer of design and construction risk goes over to the private company. That can be a problem to many design firms because protections that are built into procurement laws often aren't in existence when you're working for a private entity, a concessionaire. And many of those protections that you might have ranging everything from a standard of care to just statutes of repose that cut off the number of years that you're at risk, those could all disappear because the concessionaire has a certain amount of risk and wants to share that risk with all the parties involved. Supposedly, market competition will drive the best value. But often what we've seen is on many public-private partnerships, the scale is such that there are few entities that really want to do it, that are really willing to take on that much risk or for that period of time. So often the idea that you're going to have 2 or 3 large companies competing and to help you get best value may not actually work. There is the possibility of innovation, though, because if you cut out some of the public limitations and allow the private part of the partnership to innovate, there are possibilities that the design could be more innovative, more efficient, even more green. And again, you're looking at whole life costing. That is not an easy thing for the government to do because the government is often looking at what are my expenditures this year. If you're looking at a long-term transfer to a concessionaire to build and operate, maintain a system, that's often seen as a way to minimize the long-term cost because the concessionaire is not going to design something that's going to be difficult to maintain if, in fact, it has to maintain it for the next 30 years. Now, this is a chart from the Federal Highway Administration publications. FHWA has been very big on trying to transfer some of the design and construction to the private sector. And what you see here is, if you look at the very lower left, you see the normal design bid build process. And it takes a lot of public financing, and it's a segmented procurement practice. You design the project first, you put out the bids, and then it gets built. You can see that design build is a little bit different, still publicly financed, but a little bit more integrated. And some people say that that's the first form of a P3. You're actually asking a design builder to take over much of the responsibility to get this project put in place. And we'll talk a little bit about how that changes how the law looks at a project. When you're talking about design build finance, you're the upper left-hand circle, you're really talking about more public finance involved. So even though the perhaps the design build of a new asset is a straightforward example of a public-private partnership, there's a lot of other things. You can look at the design, bid, finance, operate, maintain structure in the upper right. There's 2 circles there, one for availability payments and one for the risk revenue, the user fee concept. And in that, the private contractor staffs the facility, performs routine maintenance, delivers whatever technological upgrades during the life of the contract are necessary, and really is in charge of the project. Now, sometimes the government can really partner with the private sector where it's design, build, operate, or design, build, maintain. They're usually called publicly financed P3 concessions, where the government is still responsible for securing long-term financing for the project, and it does that through bonds usually. The private sector can assume more risk, and with that, usually higher potential returns by financing the project directly, in addition to taking on any or all of the other functions of a new project. This is where you see in the upper right the design, build, finance, operate, maintain. Sometimes just design, build, finance, maintain is how they're referred to, DBFMs or DBFOMs. And again, the private partners who assume the financial risk for a P3 project can be compensated in several ways. They're very complex agreements between the public entity and the private entity. Whether they're collecting a portion of revenues generated by users of the facility, the tolls on a bridge, the fares on a light rail system, that kind of stuff. Those are the risk revenue models. So the government grants the private partner the authority to collect those charges from the users directly. But the private partner is wholly responsible for achieving the demand and the revenue levels that user fees will be sufficient to pay for the project, unless, of course, the private sector gives some sort of a guarantee to the public entity where user fees are being backed by some government revenue. On the other hand, governments also can negotiate a share of the profits if revenues are higher than expected. So there have been some public-private partnerships where if the revenue from user fees is more than anticipated in the original document, the government gets some of that money basically in profit. Because the revenues are higher than what was expected or anticipated by the original agreement. We talked about the availability payment model, and that really places some long-term financial liability on the public sector, where the government agrees to make, fixed payments to the private partner in exchange for making a facility available at a specific performance standard. And that may include quality of construction, cleanliness of the facility during its operation, response times for maintenance issues. Any number of things can be put into that contract to make availability payments available. That way payments can be reduced or eliminated if the standards are not met, and the government has a way to hold a private partner to a high level of performance. Right? But of course, in that case, the public sector really has to have a revenue source or stream for ongoing payments, since they are not tied to usage or demand. There has to be a long-term commitment by the government to pay basically mortgage payments on a project. And again, many state governments, even the federal governments, have a difficult time looking long-term and allocating money over a long-term basis. Now, let's talk a little bit about what many of you are used to, and that's the design bid build method of putting a capital asset in place. Here's what happens in the traditional design bid build situation. Note that the design firm is providing services to the owner, for instance, a government agency. And in doing that, the design firm under tort law is only responsible if the design firm's negligence in performing its professional services causes a cost, loss, or damage to the owner. Right? That's the standard of care evaluation that tort law, that professional liability insurance is in place to cover. The owner is responsible for approving the design recommendations and providing an implied warranty to the contractor that the project is buildable as designed. That's called the Spearing Doctrine. It was developed from a Supreme Court case over 100 years ago. So the design firm has some interaction with the contractor, but the design firm's client is the government agency. Now, a structure for P3 can be extremely complicated. Here's, a typical one, but it often has to be negotiated on a point-by-point basis. They can get very complicated. It's really an arrangement based on financial issues and details that are far too complex for most government procurement officers, who are used to using standard design bid build or even now design build procurements. So there's often someone with a financial background working as a consultant to the government, negotiating with the financial people who are working for the private sector, the special purpose vehicle, the special purpose entity who's going to run the program. Now, there's a lot of parties involved here. And the question is, where would a design firm fit into that? And you have to look at, there's a lot of possibilities for a design firm to be active on a P3 project. Obviously, someone has to work with the government to help define the project. so that the government understands what's feasible, what the cost might be. So while it's negotiating with the public sector, the private sector part of the P3, it has some good idea of what the costs are, what's expected. Right? So then it negotiates the public-private partnership agreement. Now, there's other places for a design firm to participate. One is in the loan agreement. Yes, there are equity funding, the shareholders that are on the left of the screen, but there's usually a lot of debt funding as well. And many of those lenders want a design firm involved to have their assessment of whether or not this is a realistic project and to what extent the debt funding will be paid back from user fees or from availability payments. Design firms also get involved when you're talking about the construction. You know, most of this is going to be done by design build. So there'll be a subcontractor for the construction, a design build entity, and often buried in that design build entity is the design firm. It could leave the design build operation. Rarely does that happen though. The design firm is usually a subcontractor to the design build entity. Design firms can also work with the subcontractors who are in charge of operations and maintenance because someone has to be able to work closely with the concessionaires or the subcontractors to the concessionaires on how it's going to be properly maintained over the life of the project and what that proper maintenance does to affect government availability payments, for example. Now, one thing that should be apparent in each of these nodes in the process is that people are relying on the design firm in some special way. And that reliance can create significant risk for the design firm, especially if it's tied to contract language that often are warranty statements. While the law of professional liability, the tort law I mentioned, states that the design firm only has to meet a professional standard of care for the services it provides, whether those services produce advice or designs. Contractual law can put the exposure of design firms beyond their normal capability and certainly beyond their professional liability insurance coverage. So whether you're working with a government entity, a lender, a subcontractor, the design builder, or a subcontractor who's going to be in charge of operations and maintenance, you have to be extremely careful about the contractual risks you assume. Because most P3 projects rely on design build, there's some really significant business risks. In the most common role of design firm, you're a design provider to a design builder. Being a subcontractor in that situation puts the design firm in a difficult position. You're isolated from the ultimate client, which makes designing more difficult. But more importantly, you're gambling that you will get the final project if the design builder is successful. You're gambling your upfront effort in the hope that at sometime in the future, you'll be part of the design build team, and after that will actually be paid for your services. Right? So you need to address that upfront. You need to understand what your responsibilities are and how you can team with a design builder to go after one of these projects. Right? You do not want to be in a situation where there might only be a small stipend that doesn't cover your costs. And you certainly don't want to be in a situation where you cannot recover your design costs if the design builder does not win the project, or if for some reason the design builder wins the project and does not agree to hire you. And they may pay you for your initial services, but if you're not being paid to continue on the project, you may very well be losing a lot of your cash flow. I just wanted to show you this graphic of your business risk when you provide P3 services on a P3 project under a design build entity. We sent you a copy of the paper by Robin Banks, who presented it to our 58th annual meeting of invited attorneys on P3 exposures. And I think that this graph is from that paper. And it has more about these concerns. But one, of course, is the timing risk. How many services are you going to provide upfront on a speculative basis? And the contractual risks are those created by language in your design build contract, often slowing down from the concessionaire that goes beyond your normal negligence. And just to give you some examples, a major P3 project or a flood diversion effort required the original engineering firm during the solicitation project to work with the design build firm to estimate the amount of dirt that would be removed during the life of this project, which was a 10-year construction cycle. Now, that design firm was not only being asked to estimate the amount of dirt that would be removed, but basically to guarantee the amount of dirt, because that design builder was going to go forward with the information provided by that engineering firm when it tried to get the project from the concessionaire. If it got the project and found later that it had to remove a lot more dirt, it wanted someone to go after, and it wanted to go after the engineering firm. So you have to be very careful of that. Other examples are, structural steel, because you may design something on a preliminary basis, including how much steel might be required, and the design builder is relying on that information. So if that information proves to be false, you could be held responsible. Likewise, just estimating what the probable construction cost would be, if that's not worded properly and handled properly, it could be seen as a guarantee of construction costs. And you're at risk because of that. So somewhere in the project life cycle, you have to look at whatever higher project documents are available. For instance, the proposal the design builder is responding to. You have to really amend your design proposal to address the differing risks and responsibilities that might come up. You should understand what you need in your contract. And you need to be able to walk away from a contract before you get in so deeply, because you may get in so deeply that you're losing a lot of money up front without any real possibility that you'll make it up if the project goes forward with that design build firm. And you may be making statements on which the design builder and the concessionaire are relying that will get you into trouble far beyond your professional liability coverage in the future. Now, again, how do you do that? Well, you develop some sort of set of agreements. It could be as simple as a memorandum of understanding, but somewhere along the line you should be negotiating a teaming agreement. And often that teaming agreement can flow into a joint venture agreement or a design agreement. You're not alone in creating the teaming agreements. You should know that both the Engineers Joint Contract Documents Committee created a document in 2014 called E580, and that's a teaming agreement to pursue a joint business opportunity. That's the upfront, let's get together and go after this project. And then that can become a joint venture agreement, same number. One is called a TA, the other one is called a JV. And that becomes a joint venture agreement that really sets out your responsibilities in a joint venture, and your liabilities are somewhat limited in that joint venture as well. You can also use just the teaming agreement and then sign a design build contract after that. But you should know what's going to be in that design build contract at the time you enter into the teaming agreement, because you don't want a situation where you've agreed to work with this one contractor, this one design builder, and then you find out that the design build agreement is one that really puts you at a much greater risk than you normally would have, or over which you have no control. The AIA also created in 2015 something called the C102. That's a standard form of teaming agreement between a team manager and a team member for the purpose of responding to a solicitation and pursuing a project. A very long document name, but basically it's meant to show that you can be a team member, you can be one of the many people involved in this teaming agreement, led by some team manager, often the design builder, and you're going to use that agreement to set up what you're going to get out of the solicitation when you pursue a project. So you're not at risk for everything you do as a gamble on that project. So executing a teaming agreement is really an issue of timing. When are you going to do it? How early in the process are you going to do it? And you need to know some things that you may have difficulty learning. You don't know what the developer's financial arrangements are, and they will affect all the contracts below that. You may not have any idea what a sample lease between the public and private partners will be, so you don't know how that money is going to be flowing in the future. And you may not even know what the design-build agreement will be. And signing a teaming agreement without knowing what the underlying contracts are can be extremely hazardous to your financial viability. If you're working with a design builder you've worked with before, and you've had a contract with them before, at least you've worked out some of the kinks, some of the flow down responsibilities, so you're not taking risks that you can't manage, and you're not taking obligations that might be beyond your insurance coverage. Protections you can build into it are what are the qualifications? What are the assumptions that your part of this teaming agreement are based on? What are the conditions of performance so you know what you're doing when and when you're going to get paid for what you're doing? And as with many contracts, you want to exclude from your scope certain things. And that could be estimates that are seen as more than just a statement of probable cost, but are seen as a guarantee. Design build agreement will undoubtedly make you liable for a range of flow down contractual obligations that may include warranties, waivers of the statute of repose, and many more that can make your contractual obligations extremely risky. And again, extend your risk far beyond your insurance coverage. So fight for the protections from the very beginning. One of the issues is that statute of repose issue. In almost every state, there is a statute of repose, which cuts off the rights of parties, including your client, to sue you for negligence in your design of a project after so many years. And they range from 4 to 15, maybe the grouping is mostly around 8 to 10 years. In almost every state, that statute of repose can be really changed by contract. And what you will see in a contract with a design builder who's working for concessionaire, that both you and the design builder may be at risk for that life of the concession. So your design risk may not be cut off to either your client or to a third party after X number of years. It may last for 30 years or more, basically doing away with any protections offered to you by the state. And so you really have to be concerned about that. There's not only are you at risk for a greater amount of time, there could be a professional liability coverage issue with that. I have not seen the CNA program do this, but I think other insurers have, and they've said that, look, if you have a statute of repose that cuts off all risk after, say, 8 years, and you decide to work with your client to extend your risk beyond that 8 years, any risk beyond that 8 years is not covered by your professional liability insurance because that's a contractually assumed obligation. And contractually assumed obligations that go beyond your normal professional obligation, which would be cut off by the statute of repose, are not covered by your professional liability insurance policy. There's a contractual liability exclusion in every professional liability policy. So you have to be very concerned about, can you take on that risk? Are you being compensated to take on that risk? And do you have any control over that risk? Now, here are some of the contractual provisions, rational contractual clauses that you probably should build into the teaming agreement and certainly into the design build agreement, right? Your contractual exposures will undoubtedly exceed your normal insurable professional exposures. So you negotiate protections and disclaimers. And you want to make sure you're going to get paid and you get interest when they don't pay you. You want to make sure you still have the right to terminate your services for non-payment. That's one of the few leverage points that you have in a contract, being able to suspend or terminate your services if you don't get paid. You can transfer ownership of documents, and you will be asked to transfer ownership of documents in every case, but that should not happen until you're actually paid for the services that produce those documents. Those documents have been defined by contract as instruments of your professional service. You're not creating documents, you're expressing your professional services in a hard copy form when you create a document. So they're instruments of professional service. And the idea is that they don't transfer automatically. You can transfer the rights to them if you want, but you should not do that until you're paid. You can have a mutual waiver of consequential damages that's very effective if there's no exceptions to it. And what that means is that, for instance, if you're working with the design builder on a public-private partnership where they're creating a dorm for state university, and that private entity is slowing down the risk of the delay on that project to the design builder, you do not want to be also tied into that if you had no fault for that. So you want to avoid consequential damages, for instance, for that late delivery of that dormitory, because those consequential damages could be enormous. And you had no way of anticipating that or negotiating for that risk when you originally signed your contract. So waiving the broad scope of consequential damages is one way to control your risk. Disclaimer of performance guarantees, disclaimer of any kind of warranties and guarantees, including ranging from how much dirt has to be removed to how much steel has to be used to when a project is going to be complete. Disclaiming the warranties because you have no control over them makes a lot of sense. And often contracts will have defect remediation in them, and that's a way to avoid having to take you to court because contractually they can simply say, this did not work, you have to redesign it and you have to pay for the additional cost to remediate it. If you see that in the contract, that's put in so that they don't have to sue you for negligent performance. They don't have to prove that you did anything wrong. All they have to show is that what ended up being built wasn't satisfactory and you've contractually taken responsibility for it. And, many developers, especially and design builders, will say that they have the right to withhold payment from you. That's basically a chokehold on you, right? They're going to cut off your cash flow and pressure you into either surrendering your fee or providing other services, or maybe even paying them for some other losses. So if there's a right to withhold payment, it should only be tied to your legal liability. If you're found legally liable for some harm, one way that they can make themselves whole is to withhold future payments from you. But if they have the absolute right to withhold payments, that's not a professional liability claim. That's a contractual obligation that you've committed to, and you've given your client the option to simply not pay you. Now, as a graphic, just remember this. You are trying to conform your contract to your normal legal liability. Right? You want to link the performance not to any other contractual obligation other than meeting the standard of care for professional services that you are performing. So avoid those contractual obligations that might have to be part of a contract for work put in place, but should never be in a contract for professional services. You disclaim anything that could be construed as an express warranty or a guarantee. The law doesn't require you to make an express warranty or guarantee, and your professional liability insurance coverage must cover you for making an express warranty or a guarantee. Okay, now, design builders often provide performance guarantees, warranty on the project life, warranty on specific performance or specified performance, and as part of that, they could be liquidated damages as well as actual damages. You do not want to be trapped into these performance guarantee flow downs, right? You don't want an obligation to remediate effects for free or for a specific period following substantial and final completion that may interfere with the statute of repose. And you don't want an extension of liability beyond that period. So, again, manage risk by disclaiming performance guarantees, disclaiming defect remediation obligations, disclaiming extended warranties and guarantees. Do not provide any performance guarantees from what you're doing, because there could be reliance on your preliminary design information, because the design builder may have fixed compensation. So you want to make sure that when you're negotiating that contract, you've identified in the contract the assumptions under which you're working, right? That you're including something in there that says there will be a need for the further development of the design. What you're giving the design builder up front that the design builder may rely on for bidding is not the final design. You have to look at design contingencies, what other things could affect that design, and disclaiming liability for costing and quantity errors. There should be someone involved who can provide sophisticated costing information or quantity information. You don't want that to flow down to you unless you have that ability and unless you're getting paid for providing that service. Now, I mentioned you can also provide services under P3 to other parties besides the design builder. So, you might be providing services such as advice and estimates for the special purpose entity or the lender, or for a separate operator of the concession that the single purpose entity hires. But be careful, because there will be traps to make the party's detrimental reliance on your information justify a claim against you. So again, whether it's financing reliance on your information, whether it's a look at what the operating and maintenance costs might be in the future, you have to be very careful. And that's why you need the contractual limitations, such as limiting third-party beneficiaries, limiting those consequential damages, and avoiding detrimental reliance on statements that might be construed or identified by a court as really being warranted. Again, reasonable standard of care applicable to all your services. Clearly define your scope of services and limit what you're doing. Include reasonable payment terms. This is not different from your other contracts, right? Disclaim guarantees, warranties, and now even fiduciary obligations where someone is saying that they're relying on you as a fiduciary, which is a much higher level of responsibility than you would have as a design professional. Use standard contract language so you don't get trapped in a situation where there might be a safety exposure on the site unless you're out there performing services related to safety. And limit your liability for delays to delays made responsible by your negligent performance. Limit your liability for consequential damages. And you have to look at what your business exposures are and your professional exposures are, and understand, where the compensation is to cover those business exposures. Now, I reprinted the standard of care provision from the latest AI owner-architect agreement because I think you need that. It is carefully worded. It should be the basis of what you do in any professional service if you're an architect. The engineer's standard of care is not much different than this. So that language is really a model for anyone providing professional services. This basically restates what a jury instruction in your state says about how to determine if a professional is liable for harm caused by the professional who negligently performed professional services. Any standard of care that goes beyond these basic concepts really increases your risk in what is probably an unmanageable way. And, we'll mention indemnity again because everyone wants to have indemnity, which are really risk-shifting provisions. So anytime you see an indemnity obligation, you have to see what is it tied to? What are you being asked to do? Who are you being asked to do it for? Excuse me. Why are you being asked to do it? And, is it something within your control or not? And how can you avoid uninsurable risk? And the uninsurable risk is, your risk that is insured is your obligation to correct harm caused by your negligent performance of professional services. That's what professional liability insurance covers. A typical indemnity provision that matches that coverage, right, that doesn't extend contractual assumed risks beyond your professionally assigned responsibilities is this. In any contract, contractual indemnity provision or defense and indemnity provision that goes beyond your firm's normal legal liability to correct harm that you pay for a cost, loss, or damage caused by your firm's negligently performed professional services really goes beyond the scope of professional liability insurance coverage. Professional liability insurance covers a firm for tort liability for services that cause harm because they did not meet the standard of care. That's what this indemnification is based on. In a design-build subcontract, especially one for a demanding client such as a P3 financial entity, it will be common to have a defense and indemnification obligation that covers many other types of risks. Some of them might make sense because you have control over their outcome, but in most cases, they will simply shift risk to you and look at your assets and any cost recovery efforts. So let's just give you a quick summary here. On any P3 projects, the controlling financial entity wants really to know how much is this going to cost, what are the long-term costs going to be. They need that information to develop a financial model that maximizes their profits while providing the absolute minimum required by the public-private partnership agreement, right? Typical free market. I'm going to provide you what you want, but no more, and I want to maximize my profit in doing so. Right? P3s are not altruistic. And like government entities, they are not involved in putting a capital asset in place to make the maximum allowable return on investment. They really want to maximize their profits. And if P3 agreements are not carefully structured, the capital asset could be inadequate to meet the needs of the public, even though they meet the needs of the contractor. Now, design build firms are, looking to maximize profit while minimizing risk. And because they can be set up as a short-term operation, right? They can be set up for that one project, unlike a design firm that has continuing liability. You have to be worried about that. You have to be, worried that they may willingly assume significant design and construction risks and shift it to you as downstream party, and your liability could extend far beyond the life of that design build entity. And design firms cannot simply reestablish themselves for each project because of state registration and practice laws. So you have to have both long-term contractual and professional exposures under control. So you recognize that working on a P3 project may be the riskiest project you will ever have, and you should negotiate your contract accordingly. Take an active role managing your risk during the entire teaming and contracting process. Negotiate a contract that reflects only the risks that your design firm is willing and able to assume, and clearly defines the assumptions upon which the services are based. Now, we keep hearing that the P3s are going to be taking over more and more of the capital asset creation process. We do know that design build projects are increasing in both range and size. We also know that many of our firms that could be leaders in design build are just subcontractors in design build and are taking a significant risk because of that. So if you're getting involved in a P3 project, please be very careful. Look at that contract very carefully. Make sure your attorney looks at that contract. Make sure your insurance advisor looks at that contract. Because chances are it's going to exceed your normal professional liability, and you're probably not going to be paid enough to take on those additional risks. Okay, we do have a few questions. One is a simple one, and that is there coverage for firms who are doing P3s? And of course there is. You have the normal coverage that you have that covers you for your negligently performed professional services. The problem with P3s is they're not going to simply rely on that. If you were working for a state Department of Transportation on a project, they usually understand what's insurable and what's not, and they usually have some concern about that. With a P3, they rarely care what's insurable and what's not. Their care is simply to shift as much risk as possible. So again, you have to be extremely careful about that. And as I mentioned, that could be as extensive as a design build contract saying you are a fiduciary in this relationship. The fiduciary is someone who handles money, someone who has to look after the best interest of the person whose money they're handling. If you're put into that situation, that goes far beyond professional liability exposure. Okay, I think that's all we can cover today. And remember that others in your firm can now, for those of you who probably haven't signed up for it, remember to sign up for the School of Risk Management. Go to the website, Schinner.com. Look for the School of Risk Management. You have to register for it. If you registered it for our website in the past, that's not sufficient. You do have to register again. There's a lot of on-demand courses on that. There's a lot of updated content with blogs and other things. There's a lot of management advisories and other things that will help you in the future. And there's a number of articles on public-private partnerships as well. So please make sure that you're going to the School of Risk Management. If you're a policyholder, you have access to the entire website. If you're not a policyholder, there's a few things you'll be able to access, but you won't be able to take the courses or download much of the information because that's for our policyholders. So with that, I conclude this webinar. We will take additional questions and try to answer them directly by email if you have additional questions. And again, I thank you for your participation.